Great to have you here. Again, there are going to be people coming in late, so you might be mindful of them and free a space at the end of your rows, if possible, alongside the aisles. I'm Father Paul Coleman, the director of the Center for Social Concerns. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Bernie Clark C.S.C. lecture. This lecture is named in honor of one of my confreres, the late Bernie Clark. Bernie Clark taught medieval history here for a number of years and died quite young while he was working at the University of Portland as director of campus ministry. While he was here, he invited students to be reflective about living within limits and determining how much it was that they needed in order to live the kind of life they wanted. And he invited them to be very deliberate about choosing those limits, and once they had met them, to be generous with everything else they made or earned. And that was a transformative message for the kind of people who inspired and support this lecture. So we're grateful to remember him at this lecture. Every year, my colleagues at the Center for Social Concerns think about the shape of the university, the shape of the world, the shape of the church, and we come up with a theme that can honor the year's events for us. And this year our theme is joy and hope. It's the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second Vatican Council in 2015, at the end of which was the approval of a famous document called Gaudium et Spes, which means joy and hope in Latin. And joy and hope are thus the themes for this year's programming. And we're really glad to have Father Greg Boyle here, who embodies those virtues in the work he's done and the kind of person he is. The more we know about Gaudium et Spes, the more impressive it is as we learn who contributed to it. One of the major contributors was a young bishop from Poland named Karl Wojtyła, who was the new Archbishop of Krakow. And as we look at the accounts of how that document was written, it's clear he had a deep contribution. Another great contributor was, again, my Holy Cross confrere, Archbishop Marcos McGrath from Panama City, Panama. Between them and a bunch of other bishops and other theologians who weighed in, their reflection on the life of the church helped bring that document to fruition. It's a document that's inspired the church for 50 years now, and we're glad to choose it as the kind of symbol of this year's programming for the center. The introduction of our speaker is the work of one of my colleagues, so I'd just like to introduce him. Bill Purcell is senior assistant to me and also associate director in charge of Catholic Social Tradition at the Center for Social Concerns. He organizes events like this for the entire university. He has great insight in how to think about Catholic social teaching, how to put it into practice, how to teach it. I'm proud to call him my friend and great to have him as a colleague here at the center and at the University of Notre Dame. So I invite Bill to come forward to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Father Paul. And again, thanks everybody for being here this evening. Again, Bill Purcell, I've been at the center, so this is my 10th academic year of being here. And this is a great event. The Father Bernie Clark, he was a very humble man. And what he loved was he loved students. He worked in campus ministry and he worked in the dorms as well as being a teacher. And so one of the things he wanted to do was how to spread knowledge in teaching and events like this. So nothing else we have to remember Father Bernie Clark, one of those many humble Holy Cross priests that really lived his vows in many different ways. And as Father Paul said, at the center, one of the things we try to do is different themes. So the theme this year is joy and hope, as we said, the 50th anniversary of Gaudium et Spes. So we'll be integrating that in different ways in the center throughout the year with different speakers and different readings. When we were thinking about that, thinking about joy and hope and thinking about kind of who are exemplars, one we thought of is Father Greg Boyle. And so we thought of, joy and hope in the hood. Some of you are going to Appalachia, you're going to think about joy and hope in the holler. But with Father Greg, he's somebody who really practices what he preaches and has really lived it. One thing I enjoy, Father Greg, met him years ago in LA, oftentimes they just call him G. And so as they talk about how G, recognizes their human dignity. And one of the things with joy and hope, when your human dignity gets recognized, how you have joy and hope within you. And so I think we're in a treat for tonight. Father Greg, just so you know, I'm the youngest of 7. He's got me beat. He's one of 8 in his family, and is a member of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, being a priest since 1984. Father Greg has degrees from Loyola Marymount, from Gonzaga, from Weston School of Theology, from the Jesuit School of Theology. And in 1988, he founded Jobs for a Future, which was a program created at Dolores Mission in Los Angeles, which I know some of you students have gone there for Urban Plunge and have gone there for your summer service in that area. And that was an effort by Jobs for a Future to address the escalating problems and unmet needs of gang-involved youth. And so Father Greg worked with the community in developing positive alternatives, and you'll hear about many of those alternatives this evening. He then, it grew, again, having that vision, and in 2001, JFF ended up becoming incorporated into Homeboy Industries. If you want to get really good food in LA, you should go to Homeboy Cafe. So I have a niece that graduated from here, and she was moving to go to UCLA Law School, so I took her there. So now she's a regular. She's a lawyer now in LA, but it's great food. But one of the things that Homeboy has really done in many ways is become a national model on gang intervention and reentry programs for ex-offenders. And as executive director of Homeboy Industries then, Father G, what he's done is become a really expert in many ways in sharing that expertise and becoming a national expert and now international. Just in the recently he's been to Ireland, he's been to Australia, he's spoken in Canada just within the past year. And he's given many different, he's somebody that you would expect actually at a commencement, as a commencement speaker. He's given many different conferences and commencement speaking different times about what is the real message of the gospel. And so he really talks about the importance of how do we give people the attention they need, how do we provide guidance, and how do we give unconditional love in order to prevent youth from joining gangs or in order to get the courage to get out of it. His awards are too numerous for me to speak about, but many of you do know him because I know, for instance, those that did SSLPs in here read a chapter from Tattoos on the Heart. And presently, he's actually writing another book as we speak. So again, I'm very excited that Father Greg is here to share his wisdom here with the Notre Dame community, and that he fits most appropriately it being the Father Bernie Clark lecture here this night. So let us give Father Greg a warm Notre Dame welcome. I think it's on.
Is it? Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you, Bill. I was here 1999. I gave a talk here, and 2010 I gave a little small gathering talk. So it's an honor to be here. My niece graduated from here in 2001, so I love this place. It's been the privilege of my life to do what I do for 30 years working with gang members. Before I flew here, a homie named Lewis, who kind of helps run the place there, big old gang member, he's become something of a public speaker in his own right, so he was kind of giving me the elements of what he thought went into a good speech. And he says, you have to pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit. So brace yourselves. I apologize if you've heard some things before because it happens in YouTube. I hate YouTube. It's the bane of my existence. I'll go to some place I've never been in my life. Went to Australia, and people, oh, I've heard that before, and I went, ugh. So it happens. Once I spoke at a foster grandparent gathering, a huge gathering in Southern California one summer, and then they invited me the next summer. I don't know why, 2 summers in a row, and After the second second summer, I see this grandmother. She comes over to me. I think she liked the talk, big tears in her eyes, and grabbed both my hands. And she said, "I heard you last year. It never gets better." So kind of hoping she misspoke there, but anyway, so thanks for your attention. Folks on the margins are just hoping for a little tiny bit of notice. I had a very earnest 16-year-old gang member stand in front of my desk. He said, "Look, I need your divided attention." I said, "You are in luck, because that's exactly what you'll be getting this evening." So I don't know. I think what brings you to this beautiful auditorium this evening has very little to do with me. It has more to do with wanting to embrace a vision and a hope that the world might look differently than it currently looks. The prophet Habakkuk writes, "The vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, wait for it." But none of us want to wait for too long, con los brazos cruzados, tapping our feet and staring at our watches. You want to make something happen. And so that's what I want to suggest in the brief time I have with you, is that what we're all called to make happen is really the creation of a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. All of us are invited in our own way to imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And so we're invited to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And we're invited to stand at the margins, because if you stand at the margins, look under your feet, the margins are getting erased because you chose to stand there. That's how powerful such a stance can be. And so you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. You stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. You stand with those whose dignity has been denied. I suspect that everyone in this room has had the privilege of being able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. With the demonized, so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. I suspect that if kinship was in fact our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice, we'd be celebrating it. I think Mother Teresa got the diagnosis right. She said the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. How do we stand against forgetting that? So what a great privilege it's been for me to, for 30 years, work with gang members, and they've taught me everything of value. But in the last couple of years, they've taught me how to text, and so I'm so grateful to them, because I find that it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people. And so I'm pretty good at it, LOL and OMG and BTW, and I'm pretty dexterous, And the homies have taught me a new one that they use quite a bit, OHN, which apparently stands for, oh, hell no. And I have been using that one quite a bit lately. So there I am in a car with two older vatos, homies named Manuel and Poncho, and they're going to help me give a talk at a high school. And so we meet at 9, so we have, 400 people who work there, and we gather for morning meeting, and after that, we go. And so Manuel's in the front seat and Poncho's in the back. We're driving, and we're not on the road 15 minutes when Manuel gets an incoming. So he reads this text and he kind of chuckles. I say, well, what is it? He goes, oh, it's dumb. It's from Snoopy back at the office. Well, I had just seen Snoopy. Snoopy gave me a big abrazo as the day was beginning, and Snoopy and Manuel work together in the clock-in room where they clock in hundreds and hundreds of our workers, all gang members. It's a hard job, actually. I said, well, what's he say? Oh, gosh, it's dumb. Hang on a second. Hey, dog, it's me, Snoops. Yeah, they got my ass locked up at county jail. They're charging me with being the ugliest vato in America. You have to come down right now, show them they got the wrong guy. Well, we died laughing, and I nearly drove into oncoming traffic. We were just howling with laughter. And then I realized that Manuel and Snoopy are enemies. They are from rival gangs. They used to shoot bullets at each other. Now they shoot text messages. And there's a word for that, and the word is kinship. How do we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate, that there is an us and a them? We're always being invited, I think, by our God to bridge the distance that exists between us. God's dream come true is that there be no daylight that separates us. Even in service, and Notre Dame is absolutely noted for this. You're so generous and so magnanimous and generative in your own service commitment as making that part and parcel of your education here. But I know your experience, everybody's experience, is initially anyway, that service, there's a distance even in service. A service provider, service recipient. You want to kind of get beyond that as well. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. The truth is, we're all in need of healing. We're all a cry for help. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend, and an extraordinary man, of course, one of the best listeners I've ever been in the presence of. If you were talking to him, nobody else existed. But famously, once he had commented, a reporter had commented to him and said, wow, these farm workers, they sure love you. And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, the feeling's mutual, which of course is the hope. How do we arrive at this exquisite mutuality where there is no daylight separating us? Years ago, there was a homie everybody called Dreamer. Nobody found more job opportunities at Homeboy Industries than this guy. But I knew him since he was a mocosito growing up in the projects, and in and out of jail, got into a gang. And I'd find him a job somewhere or maybe in one of our businesses, but he'd always sort of gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving the sale of drugs or the use of drugs. And then he'd wandered back to Homeboy. And this one time he finished a 4-month stretch at county jail, probation violation. A very smart kid with a kind of a devious, dangerous sense of humor. And he shows up in my office, sits in front of my desk. He says what homies often say, this time it'll be different. I go, all right. So with him sitting there, I call a friend of mine who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California. And this guy had hired homies in the past. I kept hoping against hope maybe he will again. And sure enough, he does. He says, have him show up tomorrow. That's a holy man right there. So Caesar begins work at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again, sitting in front of my desk. I go, híjole, Madre Santa, here we go again. But this time he pulls out of his pocket his very first paycheck, and he waves it proudly, and he says, damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job. And I said, well, gosh, who? And he looked at me strangely, and he said, well, God, of course. Oh, sure, no. That's right, that would be God right there, yeah. You thought I was going to say you. No, gosh, God's number one, yeah. He said, you are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days. I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, yeah, because God would have been had struck down your ass already by now. Well, all I remember was we sort of fell out of our chairs. We were laughing so hard. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider and who's the service recipient. It's mutual. So, as Bill mentioned, Homeboy Industries was born during the time I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, Dolores Mission. At the time, it was nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village, and at the time, it was the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other at that time, making it the place of the highest concentration of gang activity anywhere in the world, I suspect. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and my 194th 3 months ago. Not all from that community, but I run a really large gang program, so I get asked to do this. And the key thing, I think, is always to just listen, not to airlift in some outsider view of what you think might be helpful. And so I listened. And I noticed and I saw that all these junior high, middle school age gang members had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. So they were wreaking havoc in the projects and violent and selling drugs. So I went out to each one of them and talked to them alone, away from the others. And I said, hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And to my surprise, they all said yes. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand. So I remember going to the convent, which in those days was located on the 3rd floor of our parochial elementary school, first 2 floors for the school, and the entire 3rd floor for the convent. So I gathered all the nuns together in the living room, and I sat them down and I said, hey, would you guys mind, moving out and and we could turn the convent, into a, school for gang members. And they said, sure. Go nuns, I don't know where we'd be. And so that brought gang members in large numbers to the church, not to mass, but to the church property, because the school was across the street. And that upset the apple cart a little bit, because aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed, good people in and bad people out? And so that was a good gospel challenge, I think. And so then the gang members kept saying, if only we had jobs. And so myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the housing projects trying to find felony-friendly employers. And that wasn't so forthcoming. So we did a lot of things, hired them to do graffiti removal and landscaping, and 30 homies from different gangs helped build this child care center. So we did all these little projects. Then we couldn't really wait anymore because the demand was so great. So I asked a movie producer if he wouldn't mind buying this old dilapidated bakery. It had ovens across the street from the church. And I don't know, we'll put enemy gang members in hairnets and bake bread. We'll call it Homeboy Bakery. And he said, sure. So we were off and running. That was 1992. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas. Once we had plural, we came up with the highfalutin Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this venture. Anything worth doing is worth failing at, so I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And nobody ever intends to do this, but we sort of backed our way or evolved our way into becoming the largest gang intervention, rehab, and reentry program in the United States. So 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors. There are 1,100 gangs and 120,000 gang members in LA County. So it's a pretty daunting reality. And they just name just about anything that might be helpful when we try to do it. We have a lot of curricular things, so if you're one of the 350 in our 18-month training program, we expect you to work on yourself. So we have anger management and parenting and grief and loss, and everybody's in therapy. We have 5 paid therapists, but 47 volunteer therapists. Everybody has a huge case management team. We have free tattoo removal. No place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos than we do. We have a designated clinic with 3 laser machines, 1 paid physician assistant and 42 volunteer doctors, 14,000 laser treatments a year. So if any of you are regretting that tattoo of the guy who's fighting, we have a hard time with green though, so that might be green it has to be sort of black, but see me afterwards. And then, and tattoo removal, again, if you listen to people, I mean, it was born because of a guy named Frank, who I'd never met, wandered into our office 2 days after being released from Corcoran State Prison. He's sitting in front of my desk and tattooed on his forehead like a banner, like a billboard, filling the entire space, was "Fuck the world." Yeah. And he looked at me and he said, "You know, I am having a hard time finding a job." I said, "Well, Frank, maybe we could put our heads together on this one." So I'm thinking, where do I send him? You know, do you want fries with that? No. So I hired him, and he bagged bread for almost 2 years, and I found a doctor at White Memorial Hospital who gave me 1 hour a month. He had a laser machine to chip away at Frank's forehead and a few others. And before too long, I had a waiting list of 3,000 gang members who wanted this treatment, so we couldn't really stay with that arrangement. And we owe it all to Frank, who's currently a security guard at a Hollywood movie studio, and there is no trace left of the dumbest thing he's ever done in his life. Proving once and for all, as Helen Prejean always says, we're all a whole lot more than the worst thing or dumbest. And then all our training programs, we have solar panel installation training, and we have all our businesses. Homeboy Bakery is thriving. Homeboy Silk Screen, that's been around for 20 years. Homeboy Homegirl Merchandise, where we sell our logo stuff online and in our store. We just started Homeboy Environmental Services, where 30 enemy rival gang members go out to the streets of Los Angeles and clean out those storm drains. It's a tough job. We have all our farmers markets, 30 plus farmers markets where we sell our wares. If you've ever flown into Los Angeles, American Airlines, Terminal 4, there's what we call the Homeboy Cafe and Bakery. Homeboy Diner, the only place you can buy food. At City Hall, when I go home on Friday, I'm on my way to Indianapolis after this, but we're going to have our launch of our Homeboy food truck. So I'll be just in time for the press conference. And Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude, will gladly take your order. It's kind of a who's who. If you ever go there for lunch or breakfast, you'll see elected officials. You'll see the entire Dodger team came one day. It was chaos. Most chaos we ever had was when Jim Carrey came for lunch. It was absolutely a manicomio by the time he was done. A very gentle, thoroughly good soul. But once Diane Keaton came famously to Homegirl Cafe, she of Academy Award for Annie Hall and Godfather movies, big movie star. She's there with a regular, guy who's there once a week. And her waitress this day is Glenda. And Glenda's a homegirl, been there, done that, tattooed, felon, parolee, gang member. And she doesn't know who Diane Keaton is, so she's taking her order. And Diane Keaton says, "What do you recommend?" And Glenda rattles off the 3 platillos that she particularly likes. And Diane Keaton says, "I'll have that second one. Yeah, that one sounds good." And it's at that moment, for some reason, something dawns on Glenda. She looks at Diane Keaton. She says, "Wait a minute. I feel like I know you. You know, like maybe we've met." And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly. "Oh, gosh, I suppose I have one of those faces that people think they've seen before." And then Glenda goes, "No, now I know. We were locked up together." Oh gosh, that just took my breath away when I heard it. And I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly, kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind. And it's important to visit and explore what may well be on God's mind. Jesus helps us here when he says to the gathered that you may be one. I suppose he could have been more self-referential, but he actually doesn't want it to be about him. He doesn't want anybody to be a fan. He's hoping for followers. It's about us. It's about our union. It's about our kinship. It's about dismantling the barriers that exclude so that the circle widens. All of us are called to be what Alice Miller, the late great child psychologist, called enlightened witnesses. People who, through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love, return people to themselves. You don't hold the bar up and ask anybody to measure up. You just show up and you hold the mirror up and you tell people the truth, knowing that your truth is my truth and my truth is a gang member's truth, and it all happens to be the same truth. And here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks, especially those on the margins, as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. But occasionally what you have to do is you have to reach in and dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. The great scripture scholar Marcus Borg says that the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout scripture is shame and disgrace. And I think that's quite right. Take a leisurely stroll through the Acts of the Apostles and quite beyond a quaint snapshot of life in the earliest Christian community, what you'll find is the measure of health in any community at all. Things will leap off the page like, see how they love one another. There is no better measurement. There's nobody needy in this community. Excellent metric. But my favorite one caught me by surprise. A very simple sentence. It said, and awe came upon everyone. It would seem that the measure of our health as a community, even here, may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So some years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. Sometimes I don't read these things that carefully, so before I left, I went, what is this thing? Thinking I was a keynote at some conference. I go, equally, it's from 9 to 5, it's a gang in-service, I'm the only speaker. So I immediately invited 2 homies who work at Homeboy, Bobby, an African-American gang member, and Jose, a Latino gang member. And I told them, I said, you're going to get up and you're going to tell your stories. Take your time because we got a long-ass day to fill. And so Jose got up, and Jose, 24 years old at the time, gang member, been to prison, tattooed. But he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. But now he had worked his way up in our organization from janitorial to becoming a very valued member of our substance abuse department or team. And he's helping younger guys with their own addiction. So he gets up in kind of an offhanded way. He tells his story. He says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers gasped And then he said, "It sounds way worser in Spanish." And then they laughed. We got whiplash, you know. He said, "I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door. And when the guy comes to the door, she says, 'I found this kid.' And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me. My grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and some things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt you could still see the blood. Finally, the third t-shirt you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. "Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts?" And suddenly he stopped speaking, clearly overwhelmed with emotion. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could speak again through his tears, he said, "I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. And now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all," he says, "how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds?" And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. There's an idea that's taken root in the world. It's at the root of all that's wrong with it, and the idea would be this: that there just might be lives out there that matter less than other lives. How do we together stand against that idea? How do we stand at the margins and hope that they'll get erased, even as people accuse you of wasting your time? The prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And how is that not the job description of every person of faith, but to make those voices heard? There may be gangs from in the cities from which you hail. It's always important to get the diagnosis right. Nobody in this room or outside of it has ever met a healthy treatment plan that was born of a bad diagnosis. I don't believe that's ever happened. Years ago, I had leukemia, and I went through chemotherapy and feeling okay at the moment. Or as the homies still tell me, "I hear your cancer's in intermission." I said, "Yes, apparently it's stepped out to the lobby to buy popcorn. May the line be long." But I used to always give blood, and I went to give blood at the Red Cross, and the guy kind of blanched. He said, "You got to go see your doctor right away." And so I went to see my doctor, and he diagnosed me with having mononucleosis. So he treated me for mono for a whole year. I think we can agree there's probably a difference between leukemia and mononucleosis, but a bad diagnosis is never neutral. Sometimes we think it is. But a bad diagnosis puts you behind the 8 ball. You have to play catch up, and it's difficult. You want to be able to get this right. No hopeful kid has ever joined a gang in the history of kids, in the history of gangs. Hopeful kids don't. So there I am on the Dr. Phil show. I know, what was I thinking? But he was going to promote my book and dedicate a whole hour to Homeboy Industries. How bad can this be? So we thought we had talked him down from doing something crazy. And so I'm backstage, and I can hear Dr. Phil saying, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, the founder and executive director of Homeboy Industries, Father Greg Boyle." So I walk out there, and it's kind of bleachers like this a little bit. And on the stage, in the center of the stage, is a stool where Phil is sitting, and there's an empty stool next to him awaiting me. But on his side of the stage was a beautiful, gorgeous mahogany coffin on 4 wheels on those little dolly deals. On my side of the stage is a perfectly reconstructed jail cell with bed and bars and sink and toilet. They went to great expense for these 2 set pieces. Well, you already know where this is going. So the producers fly out, all told, 3 teenagers, males, 14, 15, 16, African-American, a Latino, and a Caucasian kid, all with their very distraught single mothers. They brought them out one at a time, and Phil would kind of grab each kid figuratively by the lapel. These are all kids who are gravitating apparently perilously close to gang involvement. And he would kind of grab them, in a sense, and say, "Don't you see where this choice is leading you?" I thought that was a pretty good Phil. No? Okay. I have no idea what I've only been on a show once. But anyway, so he would point to the coffin and to the jail cell. "Don't you see where this choice is leading you?" And he kept doing this. Finally, the last kid, I said, "Phil, how do I break this to you?" These kids aren't awaiting more data. They don't need more information. They know this will lead to death or to prison. They don't care that it will. And that's the key diagnostic moment. That the profile of a kid who joins a gang is a kid who's so stuck in a despair he cannot imagine tomorrow. Or a kid so traumatized and damaged that he cannot see his way clear to transform his pain, so he keeps transmitting it. Or a kid who struggles under the weight of mental illness. If we knew that to be the case as a good diagnosis, then we would infuse hope to the kid for whom it's foreign. We'd help heal the kid who's damaged, and we'd deliver mental health services in a timely, culturally appropriate way. For no kid is seeking anything when he joins a gang. He's always fleeing something. No exceptions. I've never met an exception. Even when they tell you they're an exception. "Yeah, I joined a gang. Join a gang and see the world, wine, women, and song." That's just because it's too hard to say that my mom used to put cigarettes out on me and hold my head in the toilet till I nearly drowned. Every gang member who walks through our doors comes with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was frightening or frightened. And you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. And so if love is the answer, community is the context, and tenderness is the methodology. It's how you repair attachment. I'm going to finish with one story and then invite you to think of something to say and ask a question and extra credit for the students. I'll anticipate a question. I'm always asked about enemies working together, and it's dicey for sure. A homie will come in and say, "I'm ready, ready, ready." And, not everybody who says he's ready is ready. And so I'll say, "Okay, I have an opening in the bakery, but you have to work with X, Y, and Z." And I rattle off the names of rivals, enemies. And the homies always do the same thing. They think for a long time, and then they'll go, "Okay, I'll work with them, I'm not going to talk to them." Which used to bother me in the old days, until you discover, of course, that it's impossible to demonize people you know. Human beings can't sustain that. So I had a homie, a 19-year-old, a little chaparrito. Everybody called him youngster. Sometimes I use gang and placas, if they're benign, youngster, lefty, shorty. I won't call anybody sniper or psycho, I had a homie come in my office the other day, big, huge tattooed guy, right out of prison. And as he was walking in, I said, "Hey, what do your homies call you?" "Fluffy." "Mind if I just call you Mario?" So anyway, there I have youngster, and so I think he's ready. So he's in our silkscreen factory, and a big factory off the premises. Been around for 20 years. We have 2,500 customers from all over the country. High quality work, reasonably priced. We UPS to South Bend. But I digress. So I'm introducing them to about 30 workers at the time, and I have them watch them shake hands with all these coworkers. And there were a lot of rivals, a lot of enemies, but every single one shook their hand and looked them in the eye. And I think, wow, this is great. Until he gets to the last guy, a guy named Puppet, who seems to be wanting to avoid this encounter altogether. And when Puppet and Youngster are in each other's vicinity, they mumble something. They stare at their shoes. They don't shake hands. Well, I know they're enemies because I know what gangs they're from, but he just finished shaking hands with other enemies. I discover later that this is a hatred that's really quite deep and very personal, and beyond which neither of them think they can get past. So I sense that much at the moment. And so I say, look, if you guys can't hang working together, let me know. I got a bunch of people who want this job. Calladitos, they don't say a word. Well, 6 months later, a Puppet leaves his home to go to a corner store some distance from his house, and he buys something. On the way home, for some reason, he decides to take a shortcut, so he dodges into an alley, and because he's taken this detour, suddenly, unexpectedly, he's surrounded by 10 members of a rival gang, 10 against 1. And they beat him badly, and he falls to the ground. And they will not stop kicking his head until he's lifeless. Well, somebody finds his body and takes him to White Memorial Hospital, where he's declared effectively brain dead. But it's the policy there to keep you connected to machines for 48 hours. So after 2 full days of a flat read with no brain activity, then the doctors can make it official and sign the death certificate. So this allowed family and friends to gather. I was at St. Louis University giving a talk. I flew home immediately. I've seen a lot of horrible things in my life, but nothing to compare to the sight of this young man with his head swollen many times its size. It was horrifying. You could barely train your eyes on him. So at the end of the 48-hour period, the 2 days, I gave him a blessing. I anointed his forehead with oil. We disconnected, and a week later I buried him. But in the first 24 hours, while he was lying there beaten in the hospital, I'm alone in my office. It's 8:30 at night. And the phone rings, and it's Youngster, Puppet's co-worker from the silkscreen. "Hey," he says, "that's messed up about what happened to Puppet." I said, "Yeah, it is." And then with a certain kind of eagerness even, he says, "Is there anything I can do? Can I give him my blood?" And we both fall silent under the weight of it, until finally he breaks the silence, choking back his tears, and he says with great deliberation, "He was not my enemy. He was my friend. We worked together." Now, can I say that always happens at Homeboy Industries? Of course it does. Any exceptions? Not a single one. And it shouldn't surprise us that God's own dream come true for us, that we be one, just happens to be our own deepest longing for ourselves. For it turns out it's mutual. And so we inch our way out to the margins and we stand there. And God erases those margins because you chose to stand there. And people who formerly were unwelcome have now been brought in. For the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, we wait for it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So I won't keep you long, and I want to give you a chance to get some extra credit here. We're not going to do microphones or anything. We're just going to yell out. So you go. We're going to try something completely different. You raise your hand. I'll go like that. Anything? A comment? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question is about racial inequality and the great disparity there, and profiling with police and stuff. Yeah, I mean, we discuss everything, and especially in our groups, people are always kind of processing things. But everything depends on what you think something's about, you know. For example, like conflict resolution or violence reduction, you know. Gang violence, and I can only speak to that, is about something else. Gang violence is not a behavior, it's a language. It's what language is that behavior speaking? So I think that's an important thing. You know, for example, in my early years, I used to work with gangs. You know, peace treaties, truces, ceasefires, bring them together. I don't regret that I did that, and I'd never do it again. Now, we at Homeboy, we always say we don't work with gangs, we work with gang members. If you work with gangs, you supply oxygen to gangs. There are two kinds of, I always say you have to be anchored in the two refusals. You have to refuse to demonize a single gang member, and you have to refuse to romanticize a single gang. You cannot do the peace work unless you're romanticizing the gang, unless you think somehow it's Middle East or Northern Ireland, and it isn't. Gang violence is about something else. It's not, you don't bring people into a room and say, how can we work this out? You know, and nobody's going to say, you know, I want my homeland back, or I want to practice religion freely. No, it's not about anything. It's the cough that tells you you're allergic to your cat. The cat might be the issue. So it's very important to get this one right. So you can begin up here in terms of ideas. And I think racial inequality is real. But you don't want to begin there. You have to be absolutely confident in the slow work of God that begins with relationship. And I think that's the way it works. And then people feel their own power in the truth of who they are. And then they get to the discussion. But if you just begin with the issue, for example. So in Ferguson, you have the signs that say no justice, no peace. But I think it's more true to say no kinship, no peace or justice. Because peace and justice is a byproduct of our own kinship. Work for kinship, watch what happens. Watch what happens with peace and justice. I think no matter how singularly focused anybody might be on those very worthy goals, they can't happen unless there's some undergirding sense of kinship. That's stopping bullets is sort of not that's like stopping the cough of a lung cancer patient. You could do it, but the patient's going to die because you haven't addressed what this is about. And I grew up in the gang capital of the world. I'm from LA. And I didn't join a gang. And trust me, this doesn't make me morally superior to the kids I've been privileged to know. Quite the opposite. The day won't ever come when will be asked to carry what these kids have asked to carry. Yes, sir.
You speak about the importance of not focusing on us and them. You speak about brother kinship. What do you think the best way is to overcome the stigma that a lot of people have about people that have been through the jail system, any prison system, or who have been in that gang overcoming the stigma and interacting with them?
Yeah, I mean, again, demonizing is always an untruth. There are no demons, not anywhere, nowhere. There are no bad guys. A lot of times, a lot of law enforcement, sometimes their internal motto is get the bad guy. But there are no bad guys. There aren't. That's just some way to kind of create this distance that separates us. That's some way for us to insist that we don't belong to each other, but we do. Even we try to find some rational reason for some of the crazy things that have happened. The number of mass serial shootings or mass shootings at schools and stuff. And whatever can strike the high moral distance between us and that person doesn't really help us. It's demonizing. And as long as we can identify it as an essential untruth, then we can get somewhere. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So when you say the Dr. Phil incident, is that like a typical of our culture? And have you ever met people who thought like Dr. Phil but have changed their ways and criteria things?
Well, I think the Dr. Phil thing illustrates that people feel like this is rational, and if only we inserted message here, if only they knew what the price we pay. Bill Clinton once said in a State of the Union address about gang members, he said, they just don't know the high cost we pay. What are you talking about? I mean, I've lived in a very poor community for 30 years, the poorest in LA. Trust me, they know the high price and cost we pay. They're not awaiting more information. And people always kind of feel that that's the case. And so you stand back and you say, there must be some positive that's luring, drawing, and attracting a kid. But boy, if only they knew this will end in death or prison. Find me a gang member who doesn't know that. I've never met one. They all know it does. It's just a kind of a symptom of their own having given up. This is kind of a parenthesis. I'm in 25 different detention facilities as a priest where I say Mass. And I went into this big camp, 100 gang members. We just said Mass, and I was kind of doing the dishes and taking my alb off, and the homies come around, and they, want to talk, and they all want my card, I always give out my card. Well, a kid came up to me the other day, hey, how do I get your credit card? Jack my wallet, I guess, Oh, here, well, no, you can have that. So we're talking, and some guy said, hey, I saw you on Oprah. I go, well, no, actually, it was Dr. Phil. He goes, oh. I said, yeah, I have a hard time telling those two apart myself. And a kid over here said, you were on Dr. Phil? Fighting with your wife? These guys died laughing, and I said, yeah, but he really gave us good advice. We're doing much better, thank you. I'll tell her you were asking for her. Anyway. Yes, sir.
Do you have any plans to opening restaurants and businesses in other cities?
Yeah, in 2008, when we moved to our headquarters, Wichita was the first city that came to us and said, please start Homeboy Industries in Wichita. And so we had to meet as a team and say, do we want to become the McDonald's of gang intervention programs, over 5 billion gang members served, And we decided not to do that because one of the reasons Homeboy worked, it was organic. It was born from below, And so we didn't want to airlift this into Wichita. So we said, well, we'll help you do whatever you want to do. And here are all the elements, and steal all of them except for our logo, And so the City Cafe started in Wichita. And Brotherhood Brew, which is a coffee roasting, African-American gang members, St. Paul, Minnesota. And Jobs Not Jails, organic gardening in Spokane. Most of them begin with a social enterprise and then work out, add therapy, add case manager. So we finally had our very first, we've been trying to do it for years, this past August, the first global Homeboy network. So we had 46 programs in the United States, 8 outside the country, 150 representatives from all over these places. So just to kind of see if we could galvanize something of a movement in terms of, but it's important to us not to kind of just start Homeboy somewhere. Because if I were in Wichita, I'd say, what do you know about Wichita? And they'd be right, Yes, sir.
I heard it's really difficult to get out of the pain, remember, to get out of that system, right?
Yeah.
How do you keep the gang members from retaliation from the own gang?
I've never seen it in 30 years. So it's one of the myths, blood in, blood out, and we're going to have to kill you if you step away. I've never seen it. Maybe somebody knows more gang members than I do, but I've never seen it. In 30 years, I've never seen it. Not once, not ever. Now, does that mean a gang doesn't kill another gang? Well, that's happened. Usually something involving snitching or some violation. But for somebody walking into Homeboy to kind of have another life, no, I've never seen it. Yes, sir.
Father Boyle, are there any challenges Homeboy Industries faces as Los Angeles becomes more gentrified and even the gang members you might work with are pushed out of areas like Royal Heights or downtown LA?
Yeah, so a lot of folks have moved to other counties, it's happened a lot in the African American community. They moved to San Bernardino or Riverside County. And that's happening for sure. The decade of death was 88 to 98, when we had the highest number of gang-related homicides in 1992 with 1,000, which is really astounding. That's gang-related homicides. And since then, the number has been cut in half and then cut in half again. So things change, including the demographics and things are starting to heat up again. Who knows the rhyme or reason? But this is about a lethal absence of hope above all, unless you address the undergirding sense of despair. And that gets exacerbated by lots of things, from poverty and race.
Father
Yes? Well, I'm going to just say two things and end. Are you giving me the hook? Yeah, so two things. One is, the key for me is can you receive people? I was privileged 30 years ago to be taught, I took a course from Henry Nouwen, and he kind of said, ministry is just, can you receive people? And I think that's the whole thing. So I had a PBS interviewer ask me, so how's it feel to have saved thousands and thousands of lives? And I said, I don't even know what you're talking about, and I don't mean to be coy or cute. My life is saved every day I walk in there. That's the only thing I know for sure. And I think saving lives is for the Coast Guard. I think you shouldn't approach any kind of service that way. So, folks will come and do community service or come and do their hours like from Loyola High School in Los Angeles. And they'll say, well, what are we going to do? I said, no. What's going to happen to you here? That's the question. And, once I had a woman say, I have to volunteer at Homeboy Industries. Why do you have to volunteer at Homeboy Industries? And she said, because I believe I have a message these young people need to hear. I go, yikes. The minute you lose the message, I hope you'll give me a call, The question is, can you come here and have your life changed by standing at the margins and with the poor and folks who've had to carry so much? Then that becomes the great equalizer. It's not people, I've never been to prison and I'm not a gang member and I don't have any tattoos. I won't know what to say. I said, it's a good thing you don't have to say anything. All you have to do is listen. And if you're the proud owner of a pulse, I'll give you a second to check. Then you can do this. Let me just finish one last story, because it's about kinship. So, it happens that people will force folks to read my book. This is why this fall, I'm kind of on the road a lot, and I'm not complaining. I think it's a great thing, But my alma mater, Gonzaga, in Spokane, forced their entire freshmen to read my book, so I went. And I brought two homies with me, Mario and Bobby, and so these guys, I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times with men and women, and I always pick, with this criteria, I pick only enemies so that they have to share a hotel room together just to mess with them, And I only take people who have never flown on a plane, just for the thrill of seeing them panicky in the air, So I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times. Nobody more terrified of flying than this guy Mario. Just a tall drink of water, skinny kid. And he was just, we hadn't even gotten on the plane yet, So we flew from Burbank to Spokane, and Burbank is a kind of a small airport. It's mainly Southwest Airlines and big bay windows. And so they have, there's no hermetically sealed chute. You have to walk out like you're the President of the United States, and they have the tarmac, and you climb up the stairs, the front stairs or the back stairs. And so I'm sitting there with Mario, and I said, well, there's our plane. A plane came in. It was early morning. And I think he may die before we even get on the plane. And so I see that our flight crew is flight attendants, and they're getting on the planes before we get on. And two female flight attendants both have big, large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. But so I should tell you that Mario is one of the most absolutely tattooed individuals who's ever walked through Homeboy Industries, and that's saying a lot. All sleeved out. His neck is blackened with the name of his gang. His whole face, except for kind of a circle here, his mouth, nose, and eyes, but everything is covered in tattoos. So I'd never been in public with him, and so we're walking, in the halls of the airport, and people are going like this, and mothers are kind of clutching their kids more closely. And I go, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were today to walk into Homeboy and say, who's the kindest, most gentle gang member who works here? they wouldn't hesitate. They'd say, "Oh, Mario, who works in the merchandise store." So kind, so gentle, over the top, effusive. As terrified as he was on the plane, the flight attendant would hand peanuts to Mario, and he didn't just take them, and he didn't just thank her. He grabbed her hand, and he looked her in the eye. "Thank you so much." It was really over the top, and so we get there, and as happens in some universities, it didn't happen here, so I'm really grateful. They'll have the big talk at night. But since you're there, how about this class, this meeting, this class, this class? There were like 9 of these things in the course of the day. And I told these 2 guys, look, I'm not going to speak at any of them. I'm going to sit in the back of the room. You guys get up and talk. And they were terrified, especially Mario, but they did a great job. Stories of abuse and violence and torture and, oh my God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. So the nighttime talk came, and it was 1,000 people. It was packed in this huge venue, and people sitting on the floor and standing room. And I told them, I said, I want you each to get up and do a little snapshot. Do 5 minutes before I speak, just so that they know who you are, so I can include you in the question and answer. And they were terrified, but they did it and did a good job. So I did my thing, and yeah, questions. And so a woman stands, and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out of the gate is for Mario. So he walks up to the microphone, this tall drink of water, and he goes, yes, and he's just terrified. And the woman goes, well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter, and they're both about to reach teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? Mario closes his eyes, and he grabs the microphone, and he's just deliberating and straining. He's getting a hernia trying to come up with the right, whatever the answer is. And before he can say the whole sentence, he says, as soon as he says those 2 words, he starts to buckle and starts to tremble and starts to cry. But he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. She looks at him and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are gentle, you are kind, you are loving, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And they decided to return him to himself, and all he could do was humbly hold his face in his hands. And I think that's the only praise God has any interest in. Only connect. Only be in relationship with people. Only bridge the distance so that there is no daylight that separates us. Stand against the illusion that we are separate. And you do that, and people will accuse you of wasting your time. But in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. And so we go from here and we make those voices heard. Thank you very much.